there was a moment when this image was taken. We had a very heavy snowfall, and I got kind of, I visited home. I got kind of trapped there for a few days. Nobody could really move. I couldn't, drive back to Dublin or I couldn't escape or leave, whatever way you want to call it. But it also happened to be the moment I found out I was going to be a dad. So you have this like maelstrom of emotion and feeling, and but there was also kind of a calmness and a realization that I can't spend my life clinging on to this kind of feeling of residual guilt. That I have to be self-determined, and I have to have my own life and use my own skills. Build my own set of values. There's that realization where you evolve or change.
Welcome to the show, Martin.
Yeah, thanks a million.
Of course, I'm so glad to have you. I've been diving into your work. I say this at the beginning of my shows almost every time, and I'm starting to notice this because I edit these. And but I spend a lot of time, before these shows, getting ready for them, and so I'm like really diving into artist work, and I'm really excited to have you on because I see a real clear evolution, and I love the research that you put into it, and so I'm genuinely excited because I think your work is really powerful, and it adds a really good it's a really good addition to this show is what I was going to say. So I'm really excited to have you today. But before we begin, go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience.
Well, my name is Martin Cregg. I am Irish. You could tell by my accent. I currently live in Dublin, which is where I am right now. A beautiful place called Inchicore, which is kind of the real historic part of Dublin. We're right in the kind of epicenter of very old historic Dublin. It's a terrific place to live, and some beautiful surroundings near the Phoenix Park, and we're near Memorial Gardens, and we're near Kilmainham Jail, which is a historic site. But my background is I'm very rural. I'm from a place called Roscommon, which I presume a lot of your audience have never heard of. It's to begin. It's based in the Irish Midlands, so kind of maybe an hour from Galway. So if you were to travel northeast from Galway City, which a lot of people will know, you will happen upon a very beautiful place called Roscommon.
Ireland is a place that I've my family has. I guess some links to Ireland. We have an Irish heritage. We kind of traced it back there, and Dublin is one of those places that my family and my brothers often talk about going to, but I've never have. I've been all over Europe, but I have not been to Dublin, and I have no idea why. Maybe I'm waiting for my brothers. I don't know. Subconsciously, I'm like, no, I can't go unless it's with my brothers. But it's a really interesting place, partly due to the fact is that I love the history, and there's just so many connections that I have. But before we kind of begin and kind of dive into the work and kind of that part, talk to me a little bit about you. How did you come to photography? I know you kind of came to it a little late.
I did. Well, I started education quite late. It wasn't really where I grew up. I'm from a kind of farming background, and I'm from a very, very rural place. There's a word called perennialistic. Things don't change very quickly, and old values they carry on through generations. And it wasn't really part of the remit for somebody like me as a teenager to think about going to university, think about going to college. There's no real academic, not necessarily for men in my family traditionally. Some of my father's siblings went on to become teachers. There's a teaching background. There's no artistic background. I don't know where it comes from. I just know I've always had an interest in history. I've always been quite a thoughtful individual. I've always been a little bit of an outsider, particularly as a teenager growing up in rural Ireland. Just to fast forward a little bit, I worked when I left school. I went straight to a factory. This was the deal, you know. I think I was 3 days of freedom when I finished my final exams, and I was thrown into a factory in a German screen printing factory in Roscommon. I think I was 18 at the time, and then I just jumped from one factory to the next, or one job to the next, or no real kind of sense of purpose or sense of belonging. And around about 1998, I did a part-time course in Galway, actually, in video production. So I thought this might be it might offer a kind of a place between stable work and creativity. But sure. They had a dark room, and they gave us the lend of some SLR cameras. It was a Pentex or something very, very basic. 28mm lens, I think it was, something wide angle anyway, which was cool. Perfect. Because it was the kind of vision it produced was very exciting for me. And to work in a dark room, to watch a latent image coming through the chemicals, to actually produce something, from through the chemistry. To do that, I'd seen it in films, I'd seen it in different movies, in a dark room, magical, and yeah. I teach now, and I see people having the same experience,
Yeah.
That doesn't leave, that kind of fascination with the fundamental things in the medium, regardless of what technology appears. That fundamental love of the magic of the medium, still there. I kind of took to photography, and I mean, I was thrown between exploring options in third level in video production or photography. I put a half decent portfolio together. This is 1999, when my time had come to leave Galway and find somewhere new and evolve a little bit. And I found myself in a place called IADT, which is an arts technology college in Dunleary, and that was the best time of my life was there. It was amazing. It was a big time of growth and change. I was terrified to go into education because I thought I was going to be too old. I was nearly 24. I thought I was going to be too old. I thought I was going to be too rural. I could sometimes times in my life I can feel my own culture and background and accent and everything. But I struggled a little at the beginning to adapt. But by second year, I was making my own work and doing things my own way. Yeah. And I was using a color darkroom. I was using medium format, and I was starting projects. That would sustain me for 10 years, 12 years.
That video connection that you talked about, that video connection is something that I actually, that's how I got into photography. And they're intimately linked. And the reason I did it is because it was completely, it was very practical. I started photography because I wanted to be better at video production and video and be a better filmmaker. And, the framing techniques, the stuff that you learn they're so intimately connected, And so I'm curious, what drew you to a video production? You're working factories. Why did you, was it just an idea, or were you watching something? You were like, I want to do that. What drew you into that class, that initial class?
I was quite lucky. I mean, growing up, I was very lucky to have a lot of, obviously you grow up in the country, I wasn't really exposed to a lot of, art for one thing. I think we had one channel on our TV. TV was quite small. It was very, very basic, and technology was very basic. I don't think we didn't have a telephone until I think it was about 13, 14. I was telling somebody the other day that my mother used to make phone calls from the neighbor's house, and people of a certain generation, people younger than me, they look at me like I'm from the 1920s, when I talk about my background. It was that basic and fundamental. I had a terrific, I wouldn't change anything. Where I grew up and how I grew up. Your question about video production, my mother won one of these old camcorders in a competition or something. We had an old camcorder, and when I was maybe 16, 17, I used to make kind of how would you say, very art house little movies of my friends, and I was also playing around with different musical instruments and recording, and I was always quite creative and productive in that way, without being exposed to an awful lot of art or an awful lot of things that people nowadays get exposed to. But I always had a love of creating something, whether it was music or writing or whatever it was. And the thing about where I grew up was, like, people who lived in a rural environment. I was surrounded by people who were farming. There was something the word is granular. Granular about the experience. It was people understand the nuances of the landscape and the textures of the landscape, and the seasons were very important, and there was that kind of innate kind of connection with nature, connection with the landscape, but it was all work all the time. There was no 9 to 5. There was no, you take Sunday off, you drive down the country, drive to the sea. There was none of that. It was work ethic. And when I think about, what I do now, that work ethic, it's like right here, I feel it. I mean, it's a different product. I mean, the product is nothing to do with farming. It's nothing to do with what my father did or my, neighbors did. But it's still similarly connected, producing images that you feel are meaningful, and the work ethic is innate. I can't escape it.
It's so true. What you're saying is so true. It's interesting is that when the sun comes up, you have things to do, and you keep working until the sun goes down, because it makes it difficult for you to finish. And at that, you eat dinner, repeat, recycle all the time. I used to work on ranches when I was a kid, and I did it because I just enjoyed the landscape. And the other thing is like what you were talking about is, I bet you can smell rain coming, can't you? You're like, it's about to rain. Yeah. Yeah. It's this connection to the planet that is so different. Until you get into a big city, you don't realize it. It's like, you don't realize that people are disconnected from that.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. And so that you feel like that work ethic is still with you, and it's kind of what drives you to make things. Is that what you're saying?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, when I teach now, I get like very anxious about being the earliest there, being the first there.
Yeah, me too.
Very anxious.
I just thought this was me. Go on. Yeah.
Things, when I'm not working, I mean, there's periods in my career. I'm 25 years in the practice of photography. It is a long time. Yeah. There are periods in that time where, obviously, I'm not productive, I'm not making anything.
Of course.
Because I'm at the end of a cycle of work, or I'm just not inspired, or I've got 2 children to look after, I've got a full-time job. And when I'm not working, I get incredibly kind of in myself. I'm not kind of, I'm not feeling
Yeah.
totally, yeah, I'm not feeling, yeah, I'm not feeling like myself really. You know, I'm not feeling like I'm fulfilling my obligation to the world. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
create.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's,
Um,
and yeah, God, I'm relating to you. I feel like this is a therapy session. I have this exact same thing. I have this exact same thing. And I never really understood where it came from until you said what you just said. That is fascinating. That really is fascinating. So you ended up, so after that, then you joined an art college. Was it an art
yes, yeah.
college?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. It was an art and technology college in
Okay. And
Dunleary.
then you
And
started to work there second year on. You started
oh yeah,
really,
yeah, my second year really, because I think first year, like I teach now, and I see that the first year of any kind of college course is it's a lot of kind of ticking boxes and covering fundamental things, and you know you do a little bit of everything, and then as a photographer, you know you don't need to know everything. You don't need to be good at
no.
everything. You need to find your hook,
Yeah.
and for me, my hook was kind of turning the camera a little away from trying to create perfect images to trying to create meaningful images. You know,
Yeah.
trying to create images that kind of communicated something about the world that I live in. So I started to photograph elements from my home. You know, things, places that were meaningful to me. I photographed. Um, you know, places where we used to hang out with children, or you know, you very basic cliched stuff. Um, but also kind of myself. You know, I started to keep a lot of kind of diaries and doing some maybe self portraits, or you know, like trying to expand the practice, but to try to give photography kind of a role in my life rather than you know trying to be the next Ansel Adams. You know, the Irish Ansel Adams. Images that are perfect never really did and still don't speak to me, you know? That kind of school of
Yeah.
thought that I was really interested in. There were moments in my student days that I could feel my interest getting stronger and stronger and stronger in the medium. One of those was seeing Jim Goldberg's Raised by Wolves, you know the book? Whoa,
Yeah. Yeah.
never seen
Yeah.
anything like this before in my
Yeah.
life. I never knew photography could have those possibilities. It was so
Yeah.
imperfect. He had everything in there. He was mixing. He had contact sheets that were drawn on. He had pieces of papers that were torn. You know, he had elements in there that were so imperfect that to me that spoke to me. You know,
Mm.
it was like it was like you were a musician trying to fit into a to a brass band, and somebody gives you, you know, Black Flag, you know, or something punk rock. You just you have that moment where you just kind of realize, you know, maybe photography has got some possibilities for me. It's speaking to me, you know. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
speaking to
Yeah.
and
It's
kind of from
interesting.
that moment, you know, you kind of let go of a lot of kind of preconceptions about what photography is. Like, and as an image maker or as an educator for 18 years, the first thing you have to do as an educator is to break people's preconceptions about what photography is and can do, you know?
Yeah.
So, like, cycles, you know? Cycles.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
For sure. Do you
mm,
think? Do you think that you're growing up that on in the rural? I always struggle with that word. Don't make fun of me in the comments. But do you think that that background and there's a do-it-yourself kind of thing that is a
oh,
something
yes.
about that? Yeah. Do you think
Yeah.
that is part
Oh,
of why you kind of like that kind
yeah.
of beating around the edges and stuff like that?
Yes, yes, yes. Because people from where I come from, they're very reliant on community, right?
Yeah.
You know, you're very reliant on community, but as a person, you're highly individual. So you're, you
Yeah.
know, you're an autodidactic,
Mm.
basically. Nobody teaches you. You don't go to college to learn how to fix something, or to, if something's broken, you got to try to do it yourself. And my
Yeah.
father could do everything. He
Yeah.
could dismantle a car and put it back together without training.
Yeah.
He could build, he could plaster, he could do electrical work, and he left
Yeah.
school when he was 13.
Yeah.
So there's an element of being reliant on your own initiative, and being resourceful, being hardworking, teaching yourself as much as you can, as much as as you need to know, to kind of, whether it's survive or just to evolve or to grow. Um, look,
There's something about that self-taught kind of thing and learning that way, because you make a lot of mistakes as you do that.
yeah,
And you go,
absolutely,
oh, well, that didn't work, so I'm going to try it a different way. And then that didn't work, and then you got to try it a different way. And so
yeah.
I think that is something that you're speaking to. I think is really, really important, especially with art. Those two things have a lot in common, because yeah, you can learn how to do it perfect, but it's also, there's all these mistakes that happen in the
Mm.
process, and there's this learning curve, but sometimes those mistakes are really interesting, and I hear that in you.
Sometimes those mistakes, when it's photography, sometimes those mistakes come back a year later as the thing you're trying to achieve. you know,
You're like, how did I
which,
do that?
yeah,
Yeah. What did I do wrong? Hold on, let me take that. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. That's funny.
I mean,
That's really funny.
I went through a kind of a phase when I was stuck in my career. I will change camera, or I'll go revert back to something from my early days. I'll pick up an old camera I have thrown in a box here. I'll put some out of date film in it, and I will, open the back. I'll double expose. I'll try to kind of, you know, create something, or some kind of look, or you know, something that pulls me out of uh, pulls me out of what's become familiar to me as an image maker. You know,
Mhm.
so you've got to you got to shake it up every now and again. It's like, again, you go back to, if you're a musician and you make a really nice album, and people are waiting for the follow up. you know, you can't do the same thing again,
Yeah.
and evolve as a creative person. You've got to
Yeah.
throw yourself in the studio and just create sound, or something will fall out. But you've also got to keep practicing, and you've got to retain the love of the medium, or the love of the practice. You know,
It's amazing.
if you're like me, 25 years in the practice, it's very easy to fall out of love with it, or be resentful towards it, or worry that, photography has become your identity a little bit too much. You define
Mm.
yourself by your photography. It's dangerous.
Mm.
Because then when you're not making work, you risk losing your self identity, or feeling of comfort in your own skin.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I
you
relate
know,
to that too.
you
Yeah.
get me. One of the ways of getting out of that is just to let go of the conception, your preconception you have about yourself, or just to um, let go of the idea that photography is the most important thing in the world, when it's not.
Mm. Yeah.
So you got to have a good balance, a good mentality. Know what's important, and know that photography is important. It is part of your identity, but it's not it's not your full identity. It's a big part of it, but it's still only a part of it.
That is so true. There are some people, they say, I'm Patrick, I'm a whatever it is, I'm a photographer,
Yeah,
or I'm a this, I'm a that. And that whole statement is identity. And
yeah,
I found myself struggling with that, because there are oftentimes I don't feel like a photographer. You know what I mean?
hmm
But I am. You know what I mean? But I'm not. I'm just Patrick that
hmm
makes things. You know what I mean? And that's what I tell people. I'm Patrick. Well, what do
yeah,
you do? I'm like, what do I not do? So it's like, I do all kinds of things. What do you want to know? Yeah. And so it's so interesting that you're saying that. And I think it's really, really important.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to kind of slide to this. Who inspires you? Like you had mentioned that one artist, and you were like, I just blew my mind.
Yeah, yeah.
Who else inspires you? Is there any other artist out there? Maybe a person, writer? Who
Yeah,
inspires you?
well, like again, there's a number of kind of bodies of work or books that I know are part of my journey. I know
Yeah.
that when I first saw this book or first saw this piece of work, like all I wanted to do was to make more images.
Mm.
Taito Moriyama, the Japanese photographer, Taito Moriyama. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
that
yeah.
guy's
I
been
do.
making work for like 100 years. He's
Yeah.
still making books, and but whenever I look at his work, um, there's just an energy about it that I want to replicate. I want to grab my camera and go, or
Yeah.
just to do something. So that, even the story of Robert Frank,
Hmm.
Robert Frank's The Americans. When I first saw this book, I was hooked.
Yeah.
Because again, it's so off key. It's not. It's kind of the antithesis of what you think photojournalism should be, or documentary should be, or the fact that it was rejected and blacklisted in the 50s
Mm.
and 60s. Like even that kind of idea that there's acceptable photography and then there's not acceptable photography, and what Frank was doing was not acceptable. That's a big draw for me, and for a lot of kind of young photographers. But there's a comment at the beginning of the Americans by Jack Kerouac, and it said that Frank was looking at the weeds behind the billboards, which I love, because photographers, we live on almost kind of like a different surface level to, can you say, non-photographers, or like the big difference between us photographers and people who are not photographers is we look at the world in a very active way, in a very different way.
Mm.
The world in a passive way. So we're looking behind
That's a
behind.
great way to say that.
I love this because it meant that my photographic heroes, there was a sense of anarchy to them, you know, but they were also doing their own thing. They weren't diving into comfortable world of image making. They were taking risks. They were producing images that were not necessarily acceptable in some paradigms of photography, which I
Mm.
love. They were kind of like doing the antithesis of everybody else, or of landscape photographers. They were subverting the kind of language of photography in some way, and
Interesting.
in their time, they're not acceptable. Some popular
Yeah, yeah.
photographer will say, "Oh, this is out of focus. It's blurry. It's useless." And then 10 years later, Robert Frank is suddenly seminal. It's the most important book of the 1950s. You know,
Yeah.
You get it. Like so,
Yeah.
like
It's so true.
the language of photography, you always need to not necessarily accept. It will always evolve, and in certain, the risks that people like Robert Frank take or Jim Goldberg take become a kind of, it becomes the orthodox in the 1990s or 2000s, or So how do we continue that type of tradition? But I don't know if that answers your question. But
No, it does. Well, and what
yeah,
I'm getting from you, I love you're quite an introspective person.
hmm,
Very
I try
reflective.
to be. Unless my
You are,
kids are here,
yeah.
there's no introspection. It's just noise.
You're like, I'm finally quiet. What am I thinking? No,
Yeah,
like that's so funny. But so talk to me about Midlands. We're about to go there. And so
sure.
talk
Yeah.
to me about how you said that was one of your first
Oh, this
projects. It
is
took you
this.
10
Yeah,
years. What's
yeah.
that?
This was Midlands was my education.
Oh,
It's when I
okay.
became. Oh yes, yes. When I became more self reliant, I started it just as I was kind of leaving college.
Yeah.
At the time, there was no photographic degree. So you did a 2-year cert, you did a 1-year diploma, and then I did a degree in fine art. There was no other option. And what I was doing wasn't really a good fit for what they were teaching, you know? So a little
Yeah.
bit. But I I started Midlands. I did kind of started doing my own thing. And if you can bring up the map, I can show you the exact moment where this realization happened on the
Okay,
slide.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Midlands, again, when I say this was my education, absolutely, because I started to give myself a sense of, to find a sense of purpose with the camera. Now, I'd been kind of gravitating towards photographing my homeland, and I'd been gravitating to photographing a lot of landscapes. I was kind of slowly developing into a landscape photographer. Into my kind of third year, into my fourth year, I started to kind of take an interest in landscapes that had some kind of social narrative or historical narrative or social meaning. I kind of wanted I wanted to throw my attention to something that was very relevant. And we're in the context of kind of early noughties, 2002, 2003, where we had a phenomenon in Ireland you might have heard of called the Celtic Tiger, where we were awash with money. So there was a lot of foreign investment, and Ireland became a kind of an example of multinational uh, uh, investment and globalization, and it became a place that radically changed in a very short space of time. And part of the Celtic Tiger phenomenon was trying to kind of create new infrastructure. And what Midlands is, and what you're looking at there in that map, is an overall remapping, reconstruction of the kind of the island of Ireland, or part of, not the full island, apart from Northern Ireland, of course. But you're looking at the construction of motorways and hubs and gateways, and basically it's all designed to try to pull investment inward, so into kind of more rural townships. And that's kind of what Midlands was about. It was a starting point that happened when I picked up a newspaper in the library in the college, and that map was in the newspaper, and just boom, because what I was looking at here was a representation of Ireland that I'd kind of never seen before. It looks so dynamic and dramatic, and it looks like it looks like we're going to completely reconstitute transport, and we're going to completely regenerate and urbanize areas, and we're going to build cities almost where cities don't exist. So this was the national spatial strategy, and the little triangle in the center, that's basically the epicenter of what we know as the Midlands. You have triangulation of Athlone, Tullamore, Mullingar, and then all of the townships and around that are going to benefit from this plan. Now, there's a problem with that. Is it's not bite-sized change. It's not slow change. It's like just this overarching change of everything. And my curiosity was based on, well, okay, that's the map, but what's happening on the ground? Because one of the kind of fascinations I had was, okay, well, if this is a kind of a utopian plan to to kind of create inward investment, to repopulate towns and cities in the Irish Midlands, there's going to be a lot of physical changes to the landscape close to where I live and where I grew up, which is highly rural. What are going to be the effects of this? I mean, what does it look like? So I suppose my my starting point was to travel around and see. record and document these kind of physical changes as I see them happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I found a lot of these little almost like symbols of change. You see this redacted piece of text in grey that was pointing towards a town, you know, and it doesn't seem to be so important anymore. We're going to bypass that, or we're going to, it's not so important. But there were a lot of these little kind of moments. But for me, it's the relationship between what's represented in a kind of a huge strategic map of the country, versus the reality on the ground that really interested me. So there's a kind of a utopian trope in the grand plans of the spatial strategy that on the ground I wanted to see how they kind of related to one another. So I wanted to see the little details and nuances of this change, so there were a lot of these little things, these little kind of almost kind of symbolic kind of elements to the landscape that I found really, really attractive at the time,
It's
So
almost humorous. It's
yeah,
do you find it funny? Do you find it funny, or do you find it like,
not
what do you?
necessarily an element. I think I find it kind of strange. Like I'm trying to figure out. I mean, I can't remember what little village or town is been redacted there, but I'm trying to figure out whether if you live there at this moment in time, does it signal that you're not important anymore? You're going to be overlooked. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, again,
Well, and it's so obvious, the contrast, that
yeah,
gray and there's such a big sign that's like, just put a new one up, right? Like,
yeah. So part of my I suppose initial interest as well is like, okay, like where does the Midlands start, and where does this process start? I mean, I grew up in general kind of area of the Midlands, but I don't really remember it being a kind of a package deal. I don't remember it being referred to as the Midlands.
mm,
Not necessarily. For me, it felt like it was a kind of an area of the country that had this kind of forced new identity. And then the question of, well, where does it start? Where does it finish? I mean, what are the entry points to this Midlands? And it made me think about, ideas of, how porous borders are, and but also as a photographer, I think to be on the ground looking for little elements, like this little arrow going into this flattened landscape, and what does it mean, and in the bigger picture. So a lot of my earlier work was like very straightforward documentation, of changes in the landscape, and just the kind of effects of this plan, or the initial effects of this plan, all shot on film. So I was photographing on my old Mamiya 7. So a lot of the photographs, I couldn't see them for maybe a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks after I'd photographed, which was a really lovely feeling, because it allowed me to kind of really observe what was going on without having to check back all the time about my composition or my clarity or my exposure. You had to kind of trust that what you were looking at was meaningful enough to press the button.
mm-hmm.
I find this image here, I find it quite strange, because that that obviously was the edge of a town. There's the lamppost at the edge of town, and all the wires have been kind of cut away from it, and it's just left kind of standing there, like almost like this strange monument to strange monument to kind of the kind of construction element that's happening.
Yeah, it's like, what's that light for? Who's there?
Yeah, it's just
Yeah,
completely
yeah.
remote and cut off. One of the
It's so
things that
funny.
I think, photography, we can visually record, obviously, but like I can remember standing there and the noise level from machinery and the dust, and then hundreds of crows flying around. It kind of reminded me of an image from the 1930s depression. The Dust Bowl, and it was a kind of a feeling and an atmosphere. I don't know if it translates through the picture, but
Yeah.
to me this is about 2004. When the landscape was really been kind of flattened and really been kind of reconstituted around kind of small rural towns and larger rural towns, to fit this new plan. So like documentation was, where really was my kind of emphasis: record and document these changes that are happening. And then once things were built, things were built very quickly, and sometimes in the wrong places. Sometimes in locations where the ground wasn't really ready for large housing estates or factories. And subsequently, further on in the Midlands project, when I revisited a lot of places, a lot of the housing estates had started to kind of sink into the landscape. So nature had started to kind of reclaim it almost. But this is a very early image I took outside a town called Roscommon, close to where I live, and it's the freshness of the environment. Everything was just really, really fresh. But also the idea that when you look at the grass, these are really strange hybrid plants pushing their way through the lawn. So it's kind of an indication of you can build all of these very fresh new urban kind of environments in rural landscape, but you're still in the rural landscape. It's it's unpredictable. So like a lot of the earlier work was this quick, unfinished, little elements of the building process that kind of interested me. Like this kind of fence that's almost finished. it's almost fully painted. It's like, let's move on to the next thing. Like, the strange thing about this is behind that picket fence is some really kind of marshy landscapes. That you kind of question down the line whether the landscape was fit for this type of construction, this type of landscape, this type of state.
Do you think it's well, I have a question for you. Do you think it's, you said it was foreign investment. Do you think it's like, this outside organization or outside group that's coming in and trying to revitalize or whatever, and they just simply don't understand the land or the landscape? Or
I just think there was a lot of funding and a lot of money were given to developers to quickly build things, and then the entire economy seemed to be, where I live, seemed to be in construction, or construction was the center of the surrounding economy. Most people from where I lived that were my age actually worked in, they worked in construction for a period of time. Like everybody was involved. It becomes.
We have an old saying.
Yeah,
we have an old saying: "Is done is better than good." Do you think that's kind of what's going on here?
Yeah, I just think there was an urgency, that it was unnecessary, and things got built very quickly, and sometimes they just, the landscape is not adaptable enough.
Yeah.
A lot of the housing estates that were built at this time, they literally just sank to the ground, and I've seen them.
So interesting.
Again, it's it's not kind of slow, kind of gradual development. That's not necessarily what the spatial strategy was. Spatial strategy was like just quickly, let's just reconstitute the landscape to become more suited to kind of people who are kind of commuting to larger towns from smaller towns, and
interesting.
It changed the economy, the society, the culture, everything changed in this period of time, you know. I think my job as a photographer was, you know, to kind of document little elements, but through the kind of process of recording and documenting, you know, I changed as an image maker. I started to kind of, you know, I started to change my emphasis and my approach and my technique, my style. You know, started to become more interested in, you know, things like the American new topographics. You know, a huge influence on me because I saw a lot of commonalities between, say, Robert Adams and Lewis Baltz and what they were trying to do and trying to say. Um, a lot of kind of similarities between what I was trying to do and trying to say. You know, and in terms of, you know, Baltz's, you know, concentration on you know, external factories and kind of textures, and, you know, the idea that you're not trying to fill the frame, you're trying to almost kind of empty the frame of information sometimes, you know, you're just kind of trying to find that balance. I think Ball said that that was a big difference between kind of painting and photography. With kind of painting, you're trying to fill the canvas. With photography, you're trying to kind of eliminate and empty it. And my interest was, I mean, how far can you empty the frame and still keep it a landscape, or still hint to the landscape, you know? And then when I started to wander around inside factories and freshly built houses to photograph, I found all these little kind of markings and little kind of textural elements or textural elements that really kind of interested me, you know? That, you know, visually they kind of interested me. You know, things that were kind of half finished, half done. And my practice started to kind of change a little bit towards a more kind of minimalist, conceptual, maybe kind of way of making things, you know. You know, this is an interior of a factory. And I just like the fact that it kind of kind of looks a little like a landscape, you know. You know, it has the same kind of format of landscape. And it's kind of referencing that kind of change from something that's unrurally and rural and green, and, you know, to something that's, you know, the landscape's purpose is suddenly altered and changed, you know. But sorry, I'm jumping back and forth here. But little kind of textural elements like that just kind of interested me visually. Yeah. But I still think it kind of references back to the kind of emphasis on, you know, complete kind of alteration of the landscape, you know. These are the kind of, you know, these belong. These are, you know, they belong to the landscape. You know, the landscape is behind this wall, but I'm denying the viewer the landscape. It's became this kind of it's became this kind of point of interest for me. Little elements that kind of drew my attention inside different factories. And then part of the kind of game, I suppose, is, you know, how far can you push the aesthetic to whiteness? How far can you push the aesthetic? You know, how far can you empty out an image and still keep it a kind of a landscape, or still keep it a picture even? So a lot of kind of my emphasis started to kind of change a little bit towards like a very, very minimal look and feel. And more towards a kind of a white aesthetic at that time. But that change was very kind of gradual, you know. And it, again, I think part of the obligation of an image maker is to kind of try to themselves push these boundaries, or push their own boundaries a little bit, you know, to change their style, change their approach as much as possible. Just to test the medium a little bit, you know.
Sure.
Test the medium a little bit.
You did this for 10 years. And so I'm kind of curious, is there anything that was interesting or kind of shocking for you to discover in this whole process, or anything that was, you know, it seems like you're investigating something. You're trying to get onto the ground level. Was there anything interesting that you learned throughout this that was, you know, that kind of impacted you?
Oh, kind of everything really, you know. I mean, part of the exploration was, it was number one, it was an exploration of, um, it was an evolution of my own practice. So it was an exploration of different techniques and different
Mm,
ways of doing things, getting different results, even by surprise, a lot of the time, you know. Because again, when you're working with film, there's that element of chance. You're not really sure what you're getting, you know. I mean, I think
hmm
even this image was overexposed, or images that like this were overexposed accidentally, you know. And when I got them back from the lab, I was like, "Whoa, look at that! Look what I did," you know. And how did I do that? And why does the overexposure work? And why does the whiteness work? And then just going down that kind of rabbit hole, you know, of exploration. Um,
mm,
so learned a lot about the practice through doing, like the technique. Every element of the practice was an education, of the practice of doing Midlands was an education. But also even just the fact that I was traveling around little towns and that I'd never been to, or walking around landscapes and locations, and being on the ground and kind of internalizing like what I was seeing and putting it into a kind of a more social context to what was being promoted on TV, or the kind of the general kind of feeling of optimism that maybe was in the country because of all this change that was happening. And naturally my feelings towards the change were very skeptical, because I saw it as being, the change was too fast. It didn't seem to be thought through or planned out incrementally. It was just this overall kind of restructuring of the little, flattening out the little nuances of our landscape.
yeah.
Now, subsequently, I mean, you know, that's just a subjective feeling, but that it's there have been there's a legacy with this national spatial strategy that it has good elements and bad elements. Good elements, road networks are better. The interaction between Cork and Dublin, and um, Galway and Dublin and places are uh, a little more interconnected. But on the downside, I think smaller rural towns have suffered. As a result of this, because no longer do people have to kind of drive through these places and do some shopping, or stop off. There has been a negative impact of this plan. So
That is really
yeah,
interesting. That is I had I had another artist. Her name is Dominica. She was talking about the same kind of idea about the constructions of roads in her town,
yeah.
actually in her country. And it's, and I think that's fascinating. And you don't realize the impact that new construction or kind of routing traffic and how that can change things. But
Mhm.
who spoke about this the best? And I'm going to make a Disney reference. Disney Cars. Have you seen that movie Cars with the
Nope.
talking cars? They talk about a highway that was constructed that took the
Yeah,
traffic away from this small town, and now they don't have
yeah,
anything to do.
yeah. I
And
mean,
now
that's
it's yeah,
yeah.
and I hate that I referenced Disney. I apologize to
No, it's
everyone.
happy
I
to,
am very
happy to, it's a good reference. It's a good reference. I mean,
yeah, but it's go ahead.
again, we adapt. Like people adapt to newer environments, and
Yeah,
we adapt and we evolve and but I think uh, the thing for growing up in a very small rural town, I think the construction of these large bypasses, motorways, it has had an effect. It has
yeah,
had an
yeah,
effect in terms of like
sure.
organic industry. Local industry. It has had this huge effect.
Yeah,
Um, but also, I mean, as you adapt, there's plus and negative to everything. I think as a
yeah, of
photographer,
course.
entering into this, I did say my natural leaning was skeptical, but also as a photographer, you're just gathering evidence of things you see, things that you find
Sure.
meaningful, little building blocks to the potential narrative. Like for me, it became Midlands. I mean, I took thousands and thousands of pictures,
Yeah.
some good, some bad. I mean, I was literally just reacting as you do as a photographer to things that you see, making a response visually to things that were happening in front of me. I mean, that's all you can do. Um, you can have an opinion based on what you see. Now, for me, um, being in in location, on location in housing estates that were freshly built, in factories that were freshly built, for me, uh, I feel like I had a strong opinion,
Mm,
because I could see, and I could feel the reality of how this change could affect, certain locations. I mean, I used to
sure.
drive from Dublin to where I live in Roscommon, rural Roscommon, and when I started college, it used to take the bones of about 6 hours because you met bottlenecks in different towns. You had to stop. You know, we had traditional stopping off points in different towns. You know, and you would be in that town, and it was kind of bustling and thriving. All these towns are bypassed now. It takes like 2 hours 20 minutes for me to get back home. You know, which of course has its benefits on a personal level. Um,
Yeah.
when you go off the motorway, as I do a lot because I'm quite I like to revisit locations that I photographed. When I go off the motorway into these towns, you can clearly see the effects that um, this plan, or the consequences of building motorways. You can clearly see what the effects that it has had. You know,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
for sure. Do you feel like your opinion changed as you went through that, or do you think
yeah,
you focused on something for a long time? So I
yeah,
think that's kind of like the question I asked earlier about anything you
mm,
discovered, but and
yeah.
you discovered a lot about yourself. But now I'm kind of curious about your opinion. Did it change?
On the implementation of the plan, is it, or the?
You started out skeptical, you were
Yeah,
unsure
well,
about some things, you were probably even negative opinion toward it at first, and but how has it changed? Has it become more nuanced? I'm sure it's probably got more. You kind of see that. I hear you saying there's positives and negatives, and so
yeah,
talk to
yeah,
me a little bit about that. I'm curious, and take us through some more images as you wish.
yeah. Sure, sure, sure. Um, no, positive and negative. Not my again. My When I look at the Midlands work, you know, um, every image I look at, I'm kind of thrown back to the moment I took it. And part of the struggle with photography is, it can only represent that small space.
Of
That's
course,
what it represents, and you can't necessarily feel the atmosphere that's there or see what's going on around it, or you have to try to force it or keep it in a context as well of why you're photographing it and why it's meaningful. Um, when I happened upon a lot of like, an image like this, that was a brand new factory, just outside a place called Longford, and it's just how fresh it felt. I mean, it's like an aura of optimism from the finished product. You get me?
yeah,
So
yeah, of
like
course.
this place has possibilities. It's so fresh. It's close to a town. It's close to a village, and it feels so fresh. When the recession happened, 2008, in Ireland, um, when I revisit that 2009, 2010, and I see the thing hasn't been filled, or I see that it's damaged, or it's someone set it on fire, or that nature is, it's completely covered in kind of marshland, or it's not been taken care of, it's not been used. You can't help but think that it was a bad idea to build it in the first place. You know,
Mm,
and then you look, you see 12, 13 of these dotted within a square mile. you got to wonder. But then on the other side of the coin is that some of these places are being, used very effectively, and people are working there and families are living close by. And so for me, I kind of, I am not necessarily on the fence with how I feel about it, but I do see I do see the pluses and negatives of the kind of decisions that were made to kind of reconstitute and restructure the landscape. The
Yeah,
landscape.
I like what you said there. The possibilities. There is something about it. I think that you know what I like about the initial idea of the project is that there's this sense of optimism and hope.
Mm, mm,
That comes from that, and but change often is fraught with fear and all kinds of things. And some people are
yeah,
going to resisting it because they like the way things are or whatever. So you have a
yeah,
little bit of both. And I hear that in you. You're like,
mhm,
I understand the optimism
mm,
and I appreciate that. But, the
yeah,
changes, whether realized or not, I think there's also there's a reflection on um, uh, possibilities unrealized that
yeah,
is often, that can be, you're like, well, why'd you do that? There's this like
yeah,
regret about changing something
yeah,
without realizing the potential of something. And so I, I think the ability for you to do that, even in these abstractions, because they're abstract, these images, they're quite beautiful. And I don't use that word very often because I don't like the word, but I don't like to use that in context of images, but
no,
the color fields, the lines, the pebbles and the dots, you're finding these little abstract moments in these images.
yeah,
Even that light, that strange light pole in the middle of the construction, you still kind of have that same sensibility. So I'm seeing
yeah,
your eye at work and your adaptation as a photographer. So it's really quite interesting. And you wouldn't, when you think of Ireland and you think about the photography, you have this romantic version of it. Those the highlands, and
yeah,
the
yeah,
hills and the coastlines and stuff like
yeah.
that. You
Well,
don't. Yeah,
again, that's kind of as I'm making it's in the back of my mind because you want to go against the stereotypical views, the postcard views of Ireland that people know. You want to almost
yeah,
subvert it in some way, and
yeah,
produce something that kind of maybe references it, but is completely different to what people might expect from a rural landscape. Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
again, like when you know, um, images like that are it's kind of far removed from um, looking like it's a rural landscape, but it is based in rural Ireland. This image, you know, um, and that's kind of the point of the kind of the point of the project. The landscape has been
yeah,
changed. Um, we've adapted to a new kind of economy and a new way of thinking, a new way of living, and these images, they kind of become like a metaphor for that change.
mm,
While still at the same time trying to reference um, traditional landscape in some format, whether it's the kind of, the kind of the composition of the image, or if people have told me that when they see this, they see a plowed field in black and white. It's
you do. Yeah,
you
it's the
use
first thing I
things.
noticed. Yeah,
Yeah. So part of it is trying to um, still reference the landscape. I mean, this could have the look of kind of a very traditional, stone wall landscape, but it's a close up of um, a housing estate, brand new housing estate.
yeah,
So
yeah,
part of the journey is trying to like you're trying to represent, record what's happening, document what's happening, but also kind of to keep within the context that this is, rural Ireland. Like a lot of the journey kind of changed then, once these factories were finished, I kind of just liked the emptiness of the place. I genuinely liked, walking around these places. It was just something for me very kind of attractive about, the kind of whether it's the palette or the textures or just the kind of different characteristics and nuances of freshly built new places. And it reminded me a little bit of what, Lewis Baltz was doing in the 70s, and maybe it's all part of the same story. Maybe it's, it's all part of the same story.
Yeah. I'm not a big fan of modern architecture that much. It's so boxy.
A lot of it is. I was living in New Zealand years ago in Wellington, and they tore down this. I mean, I didn't see what it was originally, but there was a brand new building in the place of an old building, and somebody graffitied across it like in huge writing, "Whatever happened to taste?" It's just
oh, you saw my note. You saw my note. I'm just kidding. That wasn't me, guys. I'm just kidding. But that's how I feel. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah, that's hilarious. So this evolved into a book. Did you what you prepared for us? Do you have like images of that book you could show?
I don't. I can fast track here a few of these images. That's as good as I get there, Patrick. If it's okay.
Perfect. Talk to me about what you were thinking about with those images, and so you turned it into a book. I know that can be quite difficult, from what I hear. Was that easy for you, or were you thinking about a book the entire time? Talk to me a little bit about the process of taking thousands of images and putting them into into a book. Yeah.
I mean, again, like there didn't seem to be closure to this project. There was a point where I just, it gave me something to do. I was kind of drawn to every Saturday morning or Sunday morning or any time I had off, just getting in the car and just going on location and photographing and amassing images. At the same time, you always have to, you've always got to bring the project to a close. They always have to have a place to live. And like for me, the natural place for Midlands was in book form. It had to be completed. The editing process was absolute agony. I was quite lucky in some regards that I had a kind of a room, was where my daughters are right now, that I could print really small pictures and cover the four walls and floor with images.
A good idea.
And trying to somehow compartmentalize almost different chapters, or piece together different images to create narratives, or try to kind of see how a sequence might work. So that took a long time. And it was agony because, again, I think you can start to live in your own head too much. You can start to kind of get very blinkered, because what you see in an image is not necessarily what other people will see. And that's where the paradox of the of image making is. You can see something in an image that communicates something to you, but there's no guarantee that other people will see the same thing. It's not how image making works. Like, images are, polysemic, and they have various different meanings to various different people. So that was a struggle, because images that I really loved, that were kind of standout images to me, didn't fit in the sequence, or didn't fit in the book. So after I had an initial couple of months of agony, let's say, of editing, I was lucky I had two designer friends who were in a small organization, bookmaking organization called Read That Image. I don't know if you've heard of them. They created a lot of self-published books. I was quite friendly with Vinny and Kasha, um, who were both designers and photographers, and I worked with them for a couple of years, a couple of months, nearly a year, in the final editing sequence, and then trying to, to create the self-published book. And it was amazing because, again, like, you start to look at your project in a very different way. You start to see the journey that you've come on to create this work, but then you have to, you know, you have to put it in a kind of a form where there's a kind of a narrative that people can follow. You have to make it readable. You have to give it form that suits the subject. So there's a lot of kind of little things that through the bookmaking process that I kind of, learned. I mean, again, you never stop learning as an image maker.
So true.
The book itself, when we finally concluded all of the the sequence and gave it a kind of a form and a book dummy, yeah, it was an interesting feeling, because it's like, yeah, it's like, you have to let go sometimes, and it can be very, very hard to let go of a project you've invested 10 years in, and a lot of money, a lot of travel, a lot of energy.
Of course.
We printed it in Poland. We went to Gdansk to print it. I went over. It was amazing to watch the book being printed, to sign off the proofs. All that stuff was really, really exciting. We made 200 copies, so that was the idea. You make a small run, self-published work. Did a kind of a crowdfund, kind of a pre-sale at the beginning, 50 copies to kind of generate some money. And it did quite well. It got a kind of a shortlist for the Cassell Book Award for self-publishing, which was really good.
That's awesome.
And subsequently, it's amazing where these books end up. Like, there's a museum in Melbourne, and somebody from Korea bought one, and a lot of people from the States, and names I would recognize. Photographers. So they. So the best part about doing this work is like that, that exists in collections. That's not going anywhere. It's going to outlive me. So, me as an image maker, not that all important. The importance of the work, the subject, the book, what's been shown and said is far outstrips the importance of my ego, or of me as an individual.
Yeah, I hear that a lot about people that make books. They like the book because it's more intimate. You can show somebody the body of work versus just like one print being sold, which is its own kind of game. I think, I don't want to call it a game, but it's its own kind of aesthetic and feeling. You can deliver your idea in a compact way, and it can sit in a bookshelf and people can be inspired by it later. I like how the map found its way in a design on your cover. Do you have more images of the book spread, or is this the only image you have?
With me right here. I don't
People
even have
can look at it online. Yeah, I saw it there. Yeah. So no worries. I definitely, I highly recommend, based on what I've seen already, I would love to see kind of how you paired those two together, but I can also buy the book and do it myself,
Patrick,
so can other people too. There's a great place on his website. You can go there, buy the book directly, which is awesome. I do want to give you some time to talk about we have a few other projects we're going to jump into.
Yes.
And so I want to give you enough time to do that. So talk to me about this next project that you found yourself into. And if I'm not mistaken, this is an ongoing project you're still working on, correct? So this is Fading Landscapes. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to take a breath with this for a second, but I created. There was a moment in my career where I was hyper productive, And that was around 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011. Really, really productive. And I was doing kind of, parallel projects, 2 or 3 projects. Midlands was still occupying a lot of my time, but one of the projects that I kind of was heavily invested in around 2010 was called A Fading Landscape, and again, it's about my homeland, my upbringing. It kind of comes from a place where I'm trying to explore, and I'm trying to kind of process and also represent, that feeling of kind of breaking the generational link with farming in my family. There is a very early census taken in 1848 in Ireland. It's called the Griffiths Valuation Report, and it acts like a census. You do census in the States, yeah, and you get you understand the population, the different households, where people live, what they work at. It's a kind of an overview of where the population is at that moment. 1848, there's a Griffiths Valuation Report, and on that report, there's an area there's two names on it in a town or a village called Clunalock, which is where I'm from, which is in the picture. It's where I grew up. And in 1848, there are two names. Thomas Cregg is one. The other one I've gone from my brain. But they are living and farming there in 1848. And subsequent generations from 1848 until unfortunately you get to me have been farming and working and living in this same place. It's incredible, isn't it? Part of
it is.
work.
Are you the only child in your family, or do you have
one older sister? I have a younger brother.
Did they stay?
No, no.
Oh, okay.
Lives close by. Yeah, but we the tradition of farming is something that was in my family for that long, for generations.
Wow. Okay.
So part of doing this project is possibly that lingering feeling of guilt, that you kind of have for maybe not following tradition or breaking tradition, but trying to kind of process that, trying to internalize that, but also trying to produce something about it photographically. So this is what A Fading Landscape is about. Now, I think I still feel it's very kind of unresolved, I still feel there's work to do with it. I just don't feel the story is complete. But for me to try to represent this kind of sense of maybe separation that I, feel or felt strongly at one point, was something that was very important to me, and doing it visually or doing it with the camera helped me to slow down and to really think and process, exactly what I felt and why I felt it,
Yeah, for sure.
And I think you kind of see it in the images. The images are, they're almost like charcoal. Visually, for me, they really suited. But like this image right here, it's a very strange thing to say, but there was a moment when this image was taken. We had a very heavy snowfall, and I got kind of, I visited home. I got kind of trapped there for a few days. Nobody could really move. I couldn't, drive back to Dublin or I couldn't escape or leave, whatever way you want to call it. But it also happened to be the moment I found out I was going to be a dad. So you have this like maelstrom of emotion and feeling, and but there was also kind of a calmness and a realization that I can't spend my life clinging on to this kind of feeling of residual guilt, that I have to be self-determined, and I have to have my own life and use my own skills, build my own my own set of values. There's that realization where you evolve or change. And that was kind of around that moment. It's kind of hard to explain. It's a combination of things, but I got very lucky, Patrick, with this work, because I got a box of very out of date film from a lab I was working with. They gave me like this huge box of, I think it was Fuji MPC or MPH. I think they're discontinued at the minute. But I stuck it in the camera, and I got up at like 5, 6 a.m. and I started just walking around. I could barely see what was in front of me. It had this kind of blue glow. It's kind of this landscape. But it was dark. It was dark, So because my eyes adjusted and I could kind of half see what was in front of me enough to compose the image, or to, to do certain things, or to focus, or to do the things you need to make an image. I decided to take a few pictures, which were very, very long exposures. No timer or nothing, just literally just, stick it onto bulb and just leave it open for 2 or 3 minutes and see what happens. Experimental,
Sure.
And that's this image right here.
Wow.
So you get lucky sometimes, and for me, again, that moment of taking that picture, whatever it was, a minute, 2 minutes, I could really feel it. I could feel there was something poignant about, kind of standing there still for 2 minutes, with nobody around, with no sound, with nothing. It was really, really strong. This feeling. Now, whether it represents, whether that kind of reality is expressed through the image is questionable. For me, I see it, but I don't think images can communicate all of these kind of reasons and narratives and feelings. It can't do it, But it's a nice picture.
Sure. Yeah. Well, when I first saw it, I thought it was, I went to the end of the world kind of thing, you know what I mean? Like a volcano, and that's all ash, and that's what's blocking out your field, your distance, the distance of view. I forget what I'm trying to say there. But I and then you say snow, and now I understand kind of how you took it. So now it makes a lot of sense. But there is a nature of this fading, like it's all kind of, it's very monochromatic, and it's flat. It's not very high in contrast, and it's starting to kind of fade, almost as if you didn't fix the image and it's starting to disappear, So it's kind of got that feeling to it. Take us through some more. I want to make sure that we have enough time to see it all. So and so
I'll
go
fly
ahead.
through this. So this taken around the same time, and this was like a moment I went back to back home. I hadn't been for quite a while. I think I got busy, and when I revisited, I walked into my old room, and there had been a huge paint job that happened, and everything was stripped bare. And I just found that moment really kind of, it was kind of like a moment of clarity that, like, this is such an emptiness to that room now. All of my character, everything I had in there was kind of gone, And this was it's important, for me. Sometimes you need to be kind of pushed, You need to be pushed that little bit, because you can cling on to romantic ideals of where you're from and your identity and your home, and you can invent a lot of things as well, about the way you grew up, or you can be stuck in reverie about a past that didn't exist, but when you photograph something, you have almost the hard evidence of it. You have like the reality of there's what you were looking at that made you feel this way.
Yeah.
You get me? Now, again, there's no guarantee, and that's the paradox. There's no guarantee other people will feel the same way. It's impossible, that everybody sees the same thing in the picture. But for me, it was like a marker, of, okay, this is a transitional point where I have to decide that, okay, I'm going to become a father. I have my career and my own skills. I have my own kind of character and outlooks. This is good. I'm looking at this. This is like, you know, this is a good moment for me. You know,
Yeah.
but
It's
also
like
it's
a
quite
blank
a
canvas. It's like
yeah,
a
yeah,
blank canvas
yeah,
waiting for color. This also reminds me of where you would wake up if you were in heaven. Clean sheets, everything's white, and
yeah.
you're like, well, did I die? No. Um, yeah, it's
So
got that kind of feeling to it. Yeah. But also
yeah,
if it tied to your title,
yeah,
it's kind of got the same kind of feeling to it.
yeah.
Interesting. You seem to keep a visual language. You seem to find a visual language and work it.
I
Would you say
try. I
that?
mean, I try. I think that there's a visual language to suit every subject. So I think I've got to change your visual language to suit the subject. You've got to think through it, you know.
Hmm.
Like the visual, the way of representing the landscape in this project is very different to Midlands. Midlands with a very hard
Hmm.
edge. This is more a bit of more of emotional feeling to it. Um, you know, um, this image here is one of my favorites because this is the telephone line leading out of my village in this dense fog, and I just quite like how there's not really anything in the image apart from that little line. It it You can't see anything like in the rearview mirror. You know, you can't
Yeah,
look back.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
There's a lot of kind of elements to this that kind of suit the story. And again, I was like pushing, I'm trying to kind of push a new or an appropriate aesthetic for the project. You know,
Yeah.
look plays a huge part in how successful the images were when I eventually got them processed, because the combination of the chemistry, whatever was going on in the chemistry, and the type of light and the fog kind of seemed to come together to produce these kind of charcoal kind of feel and looking images, you know. But then other elements I was photographing. These are uh, my father's herding sticks. So every farmer attaches they ascribe um, a very kind of sense of ownership over a particular herding stick, and I started to photograph them over a period of time because my father wouldn't change his herding stick very often, and not many farmers do. They get very attached to something they walk the landscape with. So I started doing these little typologies of different herding sticks. The problem I had at the time was he was wondering where his sticks were going, where why they were missing, and so I was kind of collecting them, kind of behind his back, for my own purposes. And then part of the he would hold on to the stick for quite a while, so I had to hide it in order for him to get a new one. And this went on for more than a year, maybe 2 years. I was collecting these sticks, and then to produce them in a typological way like this is important. But I tried photographing them, each one in the same way, just kind of a bit dull and boring. Um, so I started to kind of introduce kind of a feeling of them reaching out and, introducing kind of different types of shallow depths of field into the picture, and, experimenting. So to photograph these, again, it's all experimentation. You find a kind of an appropriate way, or, you find a methodology that suits the project. You get
For
me?
sure. Yeah, of
And
course.
it's only through experimentation. And then when you see something, and your instincts tell you that um, this is a good way of doing this. This is a good way of representing this. Um,
Yeah.
Go with your gut instinct. Yeah, you got to go with your intuition and instinct. And for me, it seemed to kind of make sense. I haven't seen this for. I don't spend a lot of time looking at this work since my father died 2 years ago and a bit. I haven't really looked at it, but when I was packaging this together, right now. I'm kind of revisiting it a little bit, and I'm quite. I feel like I need to go back. There's a lot of things to shoot, to photograph and to say, and I feel it's story's not ended yet with this.
Mm. Mm.
I made.
Keep going as you wish. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, no. Just to end this, I made a little. If I can keep this going. No, it doesn't work on PDF. Never mind. Sorry, Patrick. No, there's a piece. I've made a series of little dummies of this work. 3 or 4 little dummies of this work, but I still think there's a lot of work to do with it.
For sure. It's very it's interesting. It's like we talk about Tim's episode that we had, and he's talking about how he positions himself against the world, and it's like you find your position in it, and you can kind of see that reflection in this one, and it's really interesting. When you break from your family's tradition, or you break from your family's way of being for a little bit, it's to kind of reflect on that is it's probably difficult. Would you agree?
Yeah. I mean, but again, you've got to be self-determined. You've got to have your own. You've got to evolve and grow in your own way. You've got
Yeah.
You've got to. You've got to. You've got to have your own life, your own character, your own profession.
For sure. Yeah.
Just the way it is.
Yeah. Well, and it's just an interesting place to be, because while you're in the middle of this, you find out that you're going to be a father. That changes your life drastically, as it does, and that also changed you as an image maker, which leads us to the next project, right? Which is the plot.
Sure.
Correct. Yeah. So I think that is interesting. So talk to me a little bit about that. And
yeah, absolutely. I think there's one thing that kind of happened with fatherhood and working full time, and then, other things that go on in a very, very busy life. It's very hard to find time to make work. So there was a period where I was incredibly unproductive. There wasn't a lot happening. Part of the reason was it's very hard to justify spending a lot of money on film. Film's gotten more and more expensive over the last couple of years. Predominantly, most of my work was on film, photographing with medium format. And, there comes a time where it's very hard to kind of justify making work in this way and using these processes, because it becomes a kind of a luxury almost, that that if you're photographing with this, and it also becomes a bit of a risk. And again, coupled with being incredibly busy and having to emphasize other aspects of life, I found myself kind of taking a little bit of a sabbatical for a while, kind of a forced one, just to concentrate on developing my crafts with teaching, or simply looking after the kids. Now, when the plot started, it's kind of my first serious project that was shot in digital. So again, it's very hard to force your personality from one format, which was film, to the digital format. They're very, very different in every way. The way you produce work is different. The turnaround of image is different. The characteristics of the image are very, very different. But the plot is something that started out of a kind of a thing that happened as I kind of started to become less conscious of not working so much as a photographer, not producing so much. I started to get really interested in other things, research and history, and writing a lot. And I started to kind of become, very, very, very interested in as we were approaching the kind of 100th anniversary of the War of Independence in Ireland. I started to become very interested in kind of the local, history of where I live right now, the locality. And where we live right now it's kind of like almost the epicenter of activities around the War of Independence here. And what the plot is, it started with work about there's a moment that happened in the context of the War of Independence called Bloody Sunday. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, actually, have. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, not to mix it up with what happened in Derry. Bloody Sunday happened in November 1920 in Dublin, and Dublin at the time was under British rule, and everything centered around Dublin Castle, which is not far from here. We're talking about 25-30 minute walk from here. This is the center of British power in Ireland, and there was an incident that happened on the morning of November 20th, 1920, where IRA volunteers, young volunteers for the IRA, Republican movement, decided to ambush and decided to kill British agents in the morning. So British agents some were living here covertly, in kind of residential buildings around Dublin city centre. So they decided to coordinate an attack on British agents. Now, most of this happened was a precursor to what happened, the famous incident in the afternoon, which was British auxiliaries and a kind of a hired mercenary group, you could call them, called the Black and Tans because of the uniforms they wore, burst into a GAA grounds, a football pitch, where there were thousands of supporters, and just indiscriminately started to shoot at civilians, killing civilians, including children. So that was kind of like that was a very important moment in the War of Independence. So for me, what I started to look at was this kind of details of this history surrounding this day, and it started with kind of photographing the locations where these British agents were killed. And this is Mount Street in Dublin, just off Mount Street, where a number of British agents were killed in that morning. And I got quite lucky again. You get quite lucky. I've mentioned luck a lot in this, as we're talking. But you remember a thing called the pandemic?
No, I wasn't there. No, I missed it.
Nobody remembers this. But we had, it made the conditions for photographing on the streets of Dublin very easy, because there wasn't a lot of movement of cars. And I mean, it was just, it meant for me, we had a 2 kilometer enforcement rule. You couldn't leave 2 kilometers, and then you couldn't leave 5 kilometers, which forced me to kind of explore, this locality and things that happen in this locality, and the kind of little micro histories of this locality, and to try to kind of just document and photograph the locations as they are now with the context of what had happened in the past. Because I think that like a lot of the work of photographers is to kind of activate the kind of hidden elements to the landscape or to streets. You activate the narratives that are there, that are there. You re-photograph, and then you position the photograph in relation to a kind of a context or a story. And then suddenly the perspective of looking at the street changes, that you kind of highlight the histories that are there. So this was the kind of idea for the start of this project. I started using off-camera flash a lot. You can see elements of it here, so I mean, I would either drive or walk or cycle into these locations like 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, which is amazing. Nothing's moving. I felt quite safe as well at the time, to be kind of planting little lights and setting myself up for 30-minute, 40-minute photographing the street, But the plot, it's kind of based on the kind of intelligence war that happened, because the War of Independence is largely a kind of an intelligence war where you have volunteers from the IRA and you have undercover British agents trying to eliminate one another. So like the battlefield of the War of Independence wasn't a great big grand battlefield. It was like little areas in the city or little areas down the country where kind of guerrilla activity was happening. The British were trying to, use their agents to try to find these volunteers, and these volunteers were mostly on the run. So the covert operations became really, really interesting for me because working in there's a place called Colbrua Barracks. So it's kind of like a military museum that's in Dublin. You can find all these kind of written testimonies from people who were active at this moment in time. So first-hand accounts of where they were, what they were doing, who they were watching, and the detail is incredible. So I found myself reading hundreds of these witness testimonies from kind of guys who were maybe 19, 20, maybe some were 17, some were a little older, who were volunteering for the IRA, and their job was to gather intelligence on British individuals by spying. And then when they found their information, they would create dispatches that would go to a kind of a intelligence headquarters in Dublin. And then from that point, they would activate a plan to eliminate these targets. So the idea that it was very kind of covert, number one, was really interesting to me. The idea that it was like kind of like a spy novel, was really interesting to me. That it was a real-time game of espionage that was happening on the streets of Dublin that I walk through every single day, and every single little corner seemed to have a story, a history. All of which, well, not all of which, but a lot of which was accessible to the military museum. So this is the gates to Dublin Castle, and I mean, this was the centre of British power. There's always a kind of a story about the you see the little statue on top of the arch.
Yeah.
The idea that the Liberty statue always has got its arse towards Dublin, it's facing into the castle. But I mean, this place has been photographed. It's probably been photographed 100 times this morning. But how do you photograph it and give it that kind of feel that it's something kind of happening? That was kind of the trick. So, but it meant that I had to completely change my way of working. To suit the project. Number one, the only real time to photograph was 4:30 or 5 in the morning when there was no movement. So I had to adapt to that type of light. And then secondly, to introduce kind of elements of off-camera flash, to work with the color as well, to give it kind of a consistency of color. I went with a kind of a blue hue, which seemed to work, to have that kind of visual thread all the way through the imagery.
Knowing what time of the day it is. Yeah, knowing what time of the day it is, it's appropriate. Yeah.
Yeah.
You get that little bluish in the morning.
Yeah, and a lot of this activity that happened for example, on Bloody Sunday, when the IRA volunteers created this plan to eliminate British agents, they all met at dawn. Dawn was mentioned in all of the testimonies. It was very important, and then once the bells went in the chapel, they put their plan into action. So that time was really, really appropriate. Yeah. You get me?
You have a little spy novel here. but a visual one.
Exactly.
That's exactly
Yeah.
what you built. So you're over
It's fun.
here, like
Mm.
reading it. You're in quarantine. You're
Hmm.
diving into these histories. You're learning.
Yeah.
Wow, that is just absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's really really interesting. Like, do you find yourself? You said you were interested in history? Were you always interested in history?
Not necessarily. And now again, if I'm very honest, you know, I seem to find things that I love right now at a, not necessarily an early age. Um,
Yeah, yeah. So it's
the
more
way
like
on.
a new peaked interest. Yeah.
Yeah, and again with this, I got completely pulled down the rabbit hole with this project,
Rightfully so. That sounds
and
fun.
even getting up at 4:30 when there's nobody else. I mean, there's no
Yeah.
one around. Not in the street.
I
You never
love
get the
that.
opportunity to do this.
Yeah.
You couldn't do it now, you know. Um, but just to walk around comfortably around the city, and when I look at this, like an image like this, like walking around this particular area right here at 4 in the morning, and after reading testimonies of things that had happened, the place kind of comes to life. The actual architecture hasn't changed that much from 100 years. You get me?
Mm,
Like, you
mm.
can revisit that kind of past, and I used to try to follow the footsteps of the volunteers because they detail them in their testimonies. This little element, see the little piece of text that's there beside this image. You
Yeah,
can see
yeah,
it
of
there.
course.
Yeah. Little piece of text is a witness statement from um, an execution that happened, or a shoot off that happened between British agents and IRA volunteers, and they mention that corner, and they
Mm.
mention the gunshots, and they mention all this stuff, and that's the kind of history that's there that you don't see it in your everyday life. The bus passes through that. There's a Starbucks right across from there, actually. People don't think about it, but for me, when I
Yeah.
read it, I cannot not see this now. This is the natural way I think. This is where my interest comes from. Is once you know something about what you're looking at, it changes your perspective of what you're looking at. You see this narrative like a spectral layer on top of the surface of ordinary life.
Oh my
And we
gosh.
want you want other people to see it. This is why we do it. You know,
This is a walking tour. You could do this. Yeah. You could go on this corner. But no, I don't want to cheapen it in that way. But it would be one of those things where I would be like, I would want to know where I'm standing and why. I think it's really quite interesting. And then you take your photographic sensibilities into it.
yeah,
It makes it quite interesting. So,
yeah.
and then to pair it with the text, I would want to take this book and then walk around Dublin with it. If you have a book yet, do you have a book yet of this?
No, I have a dummy that I'm waiting to get rich
I
to
think
make.
that's your next book. It's your next book. And we don't get rich
Yeah,
off books, but it definitely
the
helps.
dummy's,
But that would be really interesting. I could see this being sold everywhere. But anyway,
we
go
shall
ahead.
see.
We
No,
shall
no.
see.
Again, part of this was, I mean, again, finding these locations, and I've literally read through like hundreds of these testimonies. They're amazing. The detail level is incredible
Yeah.
of something very important that happened uh, in our city. You know,
Wow.
um,
Yeah.
and to try to find. I mean, when um, when I kind of traverse the same place that this person's talking about, try to kind of get into the mindset of, well, what was this person looking at, and what were they, what were they feeling, what were they, um, what was their experience of I can imagine this is a testimony from, there's basically a kid. I think he was about 17. A guy called Emmett Dalton, who was he was a volunteer, and he signed
Yeah.
up to murder a British agent just around the corner from here. And he was mentioning his heart beating, and he was mentioning the urge to just fly away from the city. And he was, it's a kind of like when we learn history in school, it's like it's grand history. They don't go into these little micro details, And what I love is
Yeah.
I just love these little micro details. These were real people, that were, doing something they really believed in, because of the circumstance created for them by, by the crown forces, or by the kind of a very oppressive regime. They wanted independence, and they wanted freedom, and they were willing
Yeah.
to kill. They were willing to kill for it and to die for it. And I find that amazing. And the fact that a lot of them lived very close to where I'm currently sitting makes it even more interesting. The other aspect of this is introducing, archive material, and finding ways to activate the archive material. So, I started looking very carefully through photographs from that period, and I started using like a loop and a magnifying glass and adding that to it, because I think it just almost revitalizes that sense of the past, and it draws characters from, a broad street scene, but it also has the feel of like kind of spying on someone.
Yeah, it does.
Has that feel.
It looks like a telescope, the viewfinder in a
Yeah,
telescope, or some kind of scope. That's really interesting. I like how you're not just using, like, you're not just doing a scan of it. You're actually trying to make something with it, which makes it
yeah, yeah.
quite interesting. This one's fascinating. I'm a history guy. I love it. I absolutely love it. And when I was staying in a building that was in the middle of Paris, and they were telling us that it was built in the 1600s, and I was like, you know who lived during that time? Like,
Mm,
are you telling me this was here? It just made it more powerful and impactful. And I think it would be a really interesting exercise to kind of do that where your feet are, and especially when you have, Ireland's it's got such a rich history and a long history, especially written about history, that just goes back a long way. So that would be absolutely fascinating to me. Absolutely
mm.
fascinating.
Even this is a location very, very close to me right here, and I've walked it, hundreds of times. And I read in a testimony that was this particular park was used as an arms dump, used to for hiding weapons, but also as a ground for training exercises back in 1920. And it's amazing what that knowledge can do to the way you kind of experience, and this perspective you have, and the perception you have of just what's basically a pedestrian enough landscape. So I suppose that's what kind of draws me to it. This was a location for a location that was again, it was an arms dump. In the morning of Bloody Sunday, there was a garage there. There was a back street at the time where a lot of the volunteers who were wounded, from the events of that day, were treated. So to go back there and to rephotograph it becomes important. And then marrying up the locations with some of these testimonies. I mean, these are details that are taken, that were confiscated by the Dublin Metropolitan Police at the time. There were descriptions of agents. They're writing down the height, where they go, their movements. So all these things were collated and collected, by the DMP. And we still have them, which is amazing. I mean, I don't know what percentage of these dispatches and these pieces of information that exist still, because when the British made the handover to the Irish government back in the 1920s, a lot of the stuff was kind of destroyed, because it was very sensitive material. But But a lot of these, these kind of bites of information are really important to the narrative. And one thing that really kind of, really kind of occurred to me when I was, traveling around a lot of these locations that were parts of, they were mentioned in the testimonies, and they're part of the story of 1920, in terms of the story of republicanism in 1920. When you return to these locations, it's kind of interesting. This one in particular has got graffiti on it that says IRA. It's just like, it's bizarre. It seems to keep its seems to have kept its kind of its baggage with it. So again, it's for me doing this project, it's finished now. It's done. I mean, I can't do any more with it. I have amassed enough images and information, and we exhibited this in Dublin Castle, which was amazing. Dublin Castle was the centre of British power. It's where the British intelligence office was, and to kind of exhibit that there was kind of an interesting moment for me. And, it came kind of full circle a little bit for me.
That's amazing. It's a really good story, and I think it is. I think it has historical context. You're blending it with your own images. You're reusing. It's one of those kinds of stories that I could probably dive into, and it's probably its own documentary. You could probably even write a movie about this, and I'm sure there is. You know what I mean? I'm sure there is. I just don't know about it, but I think that's a really interesting evolution. You went through an evolution, which it's very distinct. Talk about a shift. You're going very abstract. You're challenging the edges of photography. You're thinking conceptually with your first two projects. You're thinking about current time, current places, to something like The Plot, which is an evolution. I know you kind of hinted at it a little bit about, how, becoming a father and having your life change in that whole process. Talk to me a little bit more about your evolution. You have some other projects you're working on that we can't look at today, unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
Let's talk about how you feel like you've evolved as a photographer. When you look at year 0 to year 25, what do you feel like the notable differences are in you and so on? I can definitely see research in there. You know what I mean? So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, 25 years is a long time, I mean, people change and evolve naturally. I think if you get into any profession, you're naturally going to get better, aren't you? You're going to, you're also going to get bored, you're also going to feel unchallenged. And I think part of, if you are in the profession of photography, you have to change because the medium is constantly evolving, changing around you. So you have to kind of keep the pace, as much as possible. For me, that's important to know. I mean, even the fact that, 15 years ago, the cost of buying a roll of film and processing it was relatively cheap. Now it's going to, completely empty the butterflies and fluff from your pockets. It really is.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You have to, you have to adapt to that. Even the fact that, 15 years ago, there were maybe 5, 6, 7 photo labs in the city here, which could process E6, slide film, large format. They could do all that. They're gone. You have to send everything abroad. So these kind of realities force you to change. But also the idea that, digital technology is getting better, cheaper. You have to try to instill your personality into whatever kind of camera or whatever is available to you. That's the reality. I think it just makes you change. But for me, it's a kind of a kind of whatever I find interesting, whatever gives me that little hook, I get totally obsessed with, to the point that I can retain a lot of information about things I'm interested in. I'm prepared to kind of, prepared to work to try to represent something that in some story that interests me, and I'm also kind of conscious of the fact that, I maybe have 2 or 3 more projects left in me. I'm not getting any younger, unfortunately.
Easy,
So
easy. You got plenty in you. When the kids go off and they start living their own lives, you're going to be bored again, and you're going to want to do some photography. So
okay,
it's
yeah.
there's a lot more in there, I can tell, especially if you start diving into that history stuff. Oh my gosh, that stuff is just it was mind blowing, and I loved hearing it in the context. You got to let me know and our audience know when you put that out, when you finally get that published, because I think that's going to be one heck of a book. One fun to read, and then the other one too, to kind of look at the images and the stuff. I literally see people taking that book and going to those corners, and just doing their own investigations and finding their own stuff. And I think it's really, really interesting. So thank you for sharing. I do have just one final question for you, and it's the question that I ask everyone. And it's because I have a lot of people that are image makers themselves at different stages in their career, and at the beginning, middle, end. And I always like to find out if you have any particular advice for people that want to be makers, image makers themselves, photographers or whatever. If there was one thing you could tell year zero Martin, what would you tell him? That's what I'm looking for.
I think you have to enjoy what you do. You have to enjoy
Yeah.
it. You have to give photography a role in your life. You have to find a purpose. You have to, when you pick up that camera, you have to have a purpose, And if you feel like you have a purpose, you will make work. You will make work. The other thing is, embrace when you have energy to work, you embrace it. You embrace those moments and those times where you have a lot of energy to work. Because you don't always have energy, And then maybe when you don't have energy to work and when you're not working, maybe you relax a little, Maybe, try to reposition yourself or try to kind of get other interests, Take the emphasis off feeling that you're not productive, And, you might find yourself, accidentally stumbling upon your next great project, or you might overhear something in a cafe, people talking that catches your interest, But enjoy it. I think enjoy it would be and I think be yourself as well. You can only be yourself. You have to, have your identity as an image maker, and you have to be yourself. You can't be anybody else. Yeah.
I think that's great advice. And I think that is important to know. I think you've offered a lot of insights. There's that one space at the beginning of the podcast that actually I was like, we got to clip that and send that to every maker out there. But then that also too, you can tell when you look at your, as you speak about your work, you're enjoying it throughout the process. And so it has been an absolute delight to have you on today. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks, man.
Of course. And this is a great opportunity to share how people can connect with you and your website, and tell us kind of how, if you're on Instagram or Facebook or wherever you are. So go ahead and tell us how we can connect with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of well covered. I have a website, and I have all the social medias. Instagram is a good place to kind of to see new work and to connect with people and see what's going on. So
what is your handle?
Martin Cregg Photography. It's quite easy.
Okay, Martin. Okay.
Yeah.
And then Is it the same website? I think it is the same website, martincreggphotography.com.
That's the one. Yeah, that's the one.
Okay, perfect. And that's where you can also get the Midlands book and the plot coming soon. I'm pushing you on that.
Hopefully.
Coming soon. Yeah, if people are watching this and they're like, we need a book. Oh, there it is. Yes. Yeah, get that. Pick it up.
Yeah,
Someone out there that's watching this. I know you're there. So, all right. So thank you so much again for coming on. It was an absolute blast, really.
Yeah. Thanks, Patrick. Thank you so much.
All right. And to all those that have made it this far, thank you so much for joining us on the Urbanaut Podcast. If you like content like this, please like, share, and comment down below. I say this every time. It helps us with that algorithm. So liking and sharing, all of that helps support us. And if you want to help us in a little deeper way, also consider contributing to us on Spotify and Patreon. We have a Patreon page where you can actually contribute to the show and help us bring more guests to you so that we can also bring you more content like this. And as always, we'll see you next time.